I want to welcome you to the March 15th, 2026 message here at Meadowbrook Baptist Church called Arrested, Denied, and Tried, from Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 71. I want to start off this morning by telling you the story about how the arrest of one innocent man, a false arrest, led to freedom and establishment of an entire, the reestablishment of a nation. After France was defeated by the Prussians, that's the Germans in western part of Germany, in 1870, in the Franco-Prussian War, the French were forced to give the territory of Alsace-Lorraine to the Prussians. The French were deeply, of course, upset about this loss of this territory. However, the people in Alsace-Lorraine, a lot of them already spoke German, but still the French were determined that they would restock their weapons and to build bigger artillery guns that would enable them to retake this territory of Alsace-Lorraine. So they began building up their artillery weapons over the next 20 years until the French army, the French military, the French high command discovered that the drawings, the schematics for their new, bigger, better artillery weapons had been stolen, had been rather given to the Germans by a French spy. And in their discovery, they discovered that the Germans had nicknamed this spy Dubois, and he had been leaking the schematics of these new weapons to the Germans. A French spy, working as a maid in a German government building, discovered in a trash can the torn up letter from this spy codenamed Dubois, and this memo that she found was a drawing of this new weapon that the French had developed. And so the French high command began searching who could be the traitor that had stolen, or had taken the schematics of their new artillery gun and given it to and sold it to the Germans. And they figured it had to be perhaps an officer with the French artillery that could have had access. But then they decided, well, the only possible one, it had to be one of the Jewish artillery officers. And only thing that brought them to that conclusion was there was an intense anti-Semitism campaign going on at that time all across Europe that had developed. In fact, I think it was Edward Dumont in his The Jewish Nation or Jewish France or something like that, he began writing about the Jewish problem and what were they going to do about the Jews. So as they're looking for this French spy that had given these drawings to the Germans, they decided it had to be this Jewish major, Alfred Dreyfus, that because he was a Jew and he was a major in the artillery, and he must have been the one that did it. And so they put Major Dreyfus on trial, and they found him guilty, even though handwriting experts examined his handwriting and the handwriting that was on this torn up memo that was in this German trash can. And handwriting expert says, this isn't his handwriting. But the French prosecutor said that would just be like the French spy. He altered his handwriting, this Major Dreyfus, just to throw us off the track. He is the one. And they convicted him, even though he was totally innocent. of being this spy that had given over the schematics to the Germans. At that same time, newspaper cartoons depicting Dreyfus with the Star of David on his chest, they had him hanging as a traitor, and these cartoons were posted everywhere. Dreyfus was, of course, found guilty by a kangaroo court, you might say, and sent to Devil's Island in 1895, which was in French Guiana off the coast of South America. And he stayed there pretty much by himself, alone on this island, for 4 straight years. However, in 1899, the French Supreme Court, cleared Dreyfus of these charges. In fact, in the meantime, outrage had grown across France, across Europe. There were people who were pro-Dreyfus, and there was the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards that had gotten on both sides of this issue of this imprisonment and false arrest of this innocent man named Alfred Dreyfus. And finally, in 1899, the French Supreme Court set him free. But in the meantime, they actually discovered who the real traitor was. It was Ferdinand Esterhazy. And he was, all the evidence was found against him, and it was no doubt he was the one. But the French High Command didn't want to be embarrassed that they had put this innocent man in jail. So they held a trial for Ferdinand, what's his name, and Esterhazy, and found him innocent. And that guy left the country, even though he was the one that really did it. The French Supreme Court, 1899, they cleared him. But guess what? The French High Command rearrested him and retried Dreyfus again and sent him back to Devil's Island. Finally, in 1905, the French president pardoned Alfred Dreyfus. Now, in the meantime, the outrage, one of those most outraged against this false arrest of this Jewish man just because he was Jewish, was another Jewish politician and writer by the name of Zadel, I think. He wrote Judenstaat and began pushing, and Judenstaat means Jewish state. At its time, he wrote, after all this time, for an end to the persecution of the Jews, and he began writing and advocating for this. Then in 1917, the British government wrote an official letter called the Balfour Declaration, saying, we really do need, in light of this Dreyfus affair, there needs to be a Jewish state where the Jewish people can have their own nation. Of course, that led to the state of Israel being declared as a nation again in 1948. The famous false arrest of Dreyfus, all those years before, led to the rebirth of the nation of Israel. But this morning I want to tell you about a more dramatic false arrest of a Jewish man named Jesus Christ, and his arrest, his trial, and he was mocked and arrested and denied, all led to something much greater: our salvation, forgiveness of sins, eternal life, and the eternal kingdom of God. But Jesus, as we know, and as we'll read again now, was falsely accused, though innocent, arrested, even denied by his closest followers and friends. He was mocked and beaten and then, of course, crucified. And yet the arrest of this innocent one makes all the difference in our lives. In Luke chapter 22, verses 47 through 71, we read about his arrest, his denial, him being mocked, and his trial before the Sanhedrin. While Jesus was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officer of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you come for me with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. And a servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord had spoken, "Today, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priest and the teacher of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, Are you saying you're the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We've heard it from his own lips." Over and over again, Jesus has been telling his followers several times that I'm going to be arrested, betrayed, arrested, mocked, beaten, put on trial, crucified, but then on the 3rd day, rise again. In fact, in Luke 18:31, Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, "We are going up to Jerusalem. Everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. But on the 3rd day, he will rise again." We saw last week, or actually a couple weeks ago, how Jesus, as he was with his disciples at the Passover meal, at the end of that, he gave them a picture to remind them of why he came. And he wanted them to begin doing this in remembrance of him. He first took the bread and broke it. He said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner, he took the cup and he blessed it. He said, "This is the new covenant in my blood. Take and drink. Do this in remembrance of me." Then last week we saw how Jesus told Simon, he said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and after you have returned, strengthen your brothers." Of course, Peter said, "Me? I'll never disown you. I'll go to prison. I'll die for you." But Jesus said, Peter, this very night, today, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. You see, Jesus all along, you see, he has came on purpose. And even last week we saw, he quoted from Isaiah 53, and Jesus said, all of this is ready to reach its fulfillment. Of course, his disciples are totally clueless to a great extent. They didn't know at that very night they were going to be run through the mill. Jesus took them out to the Garden of Gethsemane, there at the Mount of Olives. And he says, guys, hey, you need to stay awake. Watch and pray so that you won't fall into temptation. And Peter, who had been so bold, he too fell asleep. And there Jesus prayed, Father, if you're willing, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what your will be done. Jesus came, and after he prayed the 3rd time, he came and he found them sleeping. And he says, again, get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. And while he was speaking, it says, they showed up to arrest Jesus. A crowd came up, and it says the one who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. Again, Jesus that very night had said, one who is at the table with me is going to betray me. And they all said, is it me? Is it me? And who would do this? But Jesus knew, yet willingly he would be arrested. He would be denied, mocked, and tried, and then crucified. Back on February 19th of, just last February 19th, police in Thames Valley there in England arrested the former Prince Andrew Mountbatten Windsor for misconduct in public office, specifically for sharing confidential trade information with the now infamous Jeffrey Epstein. This was the first arrest of a royal there in England for almost 400 years. The last royal member of the royal family to be arrested had been back in 1647 when King Charles I was arrested. There have actually been other famous kings and queens arrested, from Mary Queen of Scots in 1568 to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, his wife, in 1792. But today, as we look at this arrest, we look at the King of Kings, the greatest king of all times. And though much greater than Dreyfus's innocence, Jesus was totally, completely innocent. Yet as he had just prayed, Lord, your will be done, not mine. And we see his willingness as he is arrested. Judas comes, and evidently if you were a follower of a rabbi, it was not uncommon for you to go up to the rabbi and give him a kiss on the cheek. That was a sign of the teacher-student relationship. And of course, with Judas, this was totally false. And he gives Jesus a kiss on the cheek so as to identify for everyone who it is we're after. You know, this is long before there wasn't a TV and magazines or pictures so that Jesus would be easily identified. But Judas identified. You talk about a traitor. Jesus says, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? You're betraying the Son of Man. Now, this term, Son of Man, we read it at the end of this passage. Son of Man was Jesus' term that he used for himself to clearly identify from the Old Testament the kind of Messiah the kind of king he had came to be. We're going to mention Daniel chapter 7 here in a few minutes, where it talks about, in my vision at night, Daniel wrote, I saw the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven at the right hand of the throne of the mighty God. And he sets up an eternal kingdom of people of every race and tongue, and his kingdom will never end. And Jesus saying, he called himself the Son of Man. And he's saying, Judas, you're going to betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Of course, I'm sure these words would be piercing him, as they were sure to ring in the ears of Judas for the rest of his very short life. Because that very day, Judas, you think that Jesus would die at 3 p.m. that Friday. But even before then, Judas killed himself for this betrayal. Yet Jesus, knowing this, knowing that Judas for the past 3 years, there was coming a day when he would basically give him the kiss of death. That's what the mafia, they took over this practice to identify a traitor. They would, if in the organization, they would go up to the traitor. If they find someone they think is a traitor, they give them a kiss on both cheeks, the kiss of death. Here, Jesus gets this infamous kiss of betrayal. Jesus' followers see what is going down. They ask, Lord, should we strike with the sword? But they don't wait for Jesus to respond. And we know who the sword swinger is. It's Peter. We find that from John chapter 18. And Peter, of course, the one, he's here to save the day. I'll never let you down. He takes his sword and cuts off the right ear of the servant of the high priest. And we find out from John 18, the guy's name was Malchus. A real person. How would you like to have your ear cut off? Ouch. But Jesus says, no more of this. It says Jesus reaches out and touches that man's ear and heals him. Now, Luke is the doctor, the one who's writing down this gospel that Paul is sharing with, and wherever they go throughout the Roman Empire, Luke is writing this gospel in the Greek language so he can share with others the life of Jesus. Luke makes sure that he follows up on this injury, this ear being cut off, and says Jesus touches the man's ear and heals him. But there was another point that I read about this week, that Jesus was not leading an armed rebellion. They could have brought the charge, had Jesus not healed this man's ear, that this man was resisting arrest. Jesus, folks, never sinned. He willingly gave himself. He surrendered himself. And he turned to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him. He says, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with your clubs and swords? See, Jesus wasn't leading a rebellion. Rather, he was surrendering himself to the cross. He says, every day I was in the temple courts teaching, and you could have arrested me any time, but you did not lay a hand on me. Why didn't they? Because they were afraid of the crowds. But then Jesus says these cryptic words, but this is your hour when darkness reigns. Jesus surrendered himself to arrest by this crowd, to Judas. He submitted himself to betrayal and arrest. And they led him away. Seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. Now, if you read Matthew and Mark and John, you can find out in John, I think it is, that first they took him to the real power broker there in Jerusalem was Caiaphas. Caiaphas's father-in-law. Caiaphas was the high priest, but his father-in-law had been the high priest. His name was Annas, and Annas gets a few questions in. He wants to interview Jesus. Then they take him across to Caiaphas's house. But notice here it says Peter followed at a distance. Peter, just as predicted, would deny Jesus. Jesus knew this. He knew he was going to be arrested, denied, mocked, put on trial, crucified. Peter said, I'll never let you down. And certainly we've seen his valiant swordsmanship, this fisherman, as he swings and cuts off the guy's ear. He was going to show what he could do on his own, but that's not what Jesus wanted. Jesus had predicted it, and Peter powerfully said it wouldn't happen, but it did. You know, when people are popular and you say, well, you know, I'm with Jesus. You know, in fact, I'm probably the greatest among the followers of Jesus. That's Peter. And whenever Peter came around, everybody said, oh, that's Jesus, one of his main guys. But now suddenly things had changed. Jesus was no longer popular. They were wanting to put him to death. And Peter, who just moments, hours before had made this grandiose promise, I'll die with you, I'll go to prison. But now we see this one who had just swung the sword. Now he's having second thoughts. He might be thinking, wait a minute, they could arrest me for cutting off that guy's ear, even though Jesus put it back on. And at first, I think it says in Mark that they all ran. But Peter comes back around and he's following Jesus at a distance. Doesn't want to be recognized. He wants to be a follower of Christ, but at a convenient distance. And I thought about us. You know, we pick on Peter, but sometimes we want to be a follower of Christ. And on a Sunday morning, you know, when we're here and we're worshiping and we're praising the Lord out loud and, you know, all to Jesus I surrender. But then when we get out in the real world and the pressure's on and where Christianity isn't as popular, we sometimes want to be incognito, undercover, falling at a distance. Then they get to the courtyard of the high priest's house, and it's a cold, clear night because Passover is a full moon out and kind of chilly. And I think in the other Gospels talk about this fire that's been started, and, you know, it's kind of cold out. Peter all of a sudden thinks, man, I need to get up there by the fire. I'm freezing. But again, he doesn't want to be recognized, and he's there warming himself by the fire. And one of the servant girls, women there, looks at him through the flickering firelight that's exposing Jesus or Peter's faces. Surely this man was with him. This man was with him. And Peter said, woman, I don't know him. A little later, someone else saw him and said, you are also one of them. I imagine that first denial, you know, you see the progression here, falling at a distance. First of all, you're taking things in your own hands. I'll show you who I am. And then you begin have second thoughts and say, well, maybe I was a little bit too dogmatic. I'll fall at a distance. And then he's warming himself by the fires of the world. And then he's recognized, oh, he's put to the test. I'm sure there was probably a lump in Peter's throat, this first denial. But then the second guy comes along shortly thereafter, says, you also are one of them. You're one of them. And he says, man, I am not. I can't change my story now, he's thinking. And I certainly don't want to be put on trial myself. He's filled with fear. And then about an hour later, it says another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter, he blows up. He says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, many times we say, well, I never denied Jesus. But then we begin running through the mill and we deny him once, or we do something that kind of is a betrayal of Jesus, our commitment to him, and it gets a little bit easier, or we have to be a little bit more forceful in our denial. And then finally Peter, that third time, he says, knock it off. I don't even know what you're talking about. He says, you're a Galilean. You have a Galilean accent. It's all over you. You know, I've seen you. And John, it says that this man who does this final identification of Peter was the relative of Malchus, the guy whose ear Peter cut off. He says, you're the one. You're a Galilean. You were with him. And he says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And immediately the rooster crowed. Cock-a-doodle-doo. I've heard roosters crow many times, and so had Peter. But when Peter hears the rooster crowing, it cut him right to the heart. Filled with guilt. And at that very moment, it says the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, that before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Oh, the heartache. The guilt. And, you know, I've thought about this was Jesus like, oh, I can't believe you did do that. I don't think that was the look. I think the look that Jesus gave Peter was a look of compassion and concern, and also to help Peter to remember, not only had Jesus told him that, but that Jesus had said, I'm praying for you that your faith will not fail. And when you have returned, you'll strengthen your brothers. You see, Jesus knew ahead of time that Peter was going to deny him, that Peter would have the power of failure, but that was not the end. That your faith would not fail, and that you will turn back. You'll realize that you've done wrong. And Peter, evidently, he's weeping bitterly. But later he would be restored. As we think about what Jesus has done for us, and Jesus did not have a power of failure. Jesus went to the cross. He died and rose from the dead. He didn't fail. But he wants to forgive us who have failed. The one who gave his all for us. Here it says that the guards, after this, they take Jesus, and they begin mocking him and beating him. And they put a blindfold on him and demanded, prophesy, who hit you? And they said many other insulting things to Jesus. Just as he predicted back there in 1838, Luke 18, verse 31, he would be handed over and mocked and beaten. The amazing thing, folks, is that Jesus knows what is going to happen to him. And he willingly submits himself to being arrested, betrayed, denied, and now mocked. Peter says, I don't know him. Those who blindfolded Jesus, they didn't believe that this guy whom they had arrested whom they were regarding, he's supposed to be a prophet. Let's have some fun with this. They made a joke out of Jesus. Often I hear people using the name Jesus Christ as a swear word, or they're aggravating. They say Jesus Christ, not to honor him, but to just as an expression of frustration. I can't do that. These guards, they're not referencing him as really a prophet. They think, oh, what a joke. Let's test his ability to prophesy. Let's put a blindfold on and let's hit him in the face. And then, if you're the prophet that everybody says that you are, tell us who hit you. But did Jesus die for these mockers? For these men who pounded him in the face and made fun of Jesus? Did Jesus die for them? Yes. And I would love to know if it were possible, did one of these guards, or maybe some of these that even crucified him, did they come to know Jesus, who willingly submitted himself through this mockery on their behalf? Here in Luke, we find that at daybreak, the council, the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. Now, in the other Gospels, we find out, as I mentioned earlier, there had actually been some interrogation, some parts of the trial that had went on first before Annas, and then the current high priest Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. But according to Jewish law, as reported by the historian Josephus and others, and then later in a book that's called the Sanhedrin, the Rules of Sanhedrin, it was against the rules for you to have a trial at night. It was also against the rules for you to sentence someone to death and to execute them in the same day in which you've done this. There were several other things that were just plain wrong, but so to make it legit, as soon as daybreak, 5:30, 6 o'clock came around, as soon as the sun began to creep over the eastern horizon, they had Jesus brought before them again. Now, in our system of our law system, in order to keep a person in prison, you have to, their representative can ask for a writ of habeas corpus. This is a Latin term that means you may take the body. You may have custody. But in order to get a writ of habeas corpus, it's asking for proof. There has to be some kind of indictment and some sort of basic evidence that you're going to hold this person over for trial. And here, before, of course, the goal, the aim of the Jesus' enemies and the high priest Sanhedrin is they want to put Jesus to death. They could not do that. They didn't have the authority, and they didn't probably even greater than that, they didn't want to be blamed for putting Jesus to death, because there were people that said, hey, could this be the Messiah? Instead, they wanted to bring up charges saying that Jesus said that he was the Messiah. He was trying to lead a rebellion. That way they could take it to Pilate, and Pilate would put him to death. So they asked him this question. Verse 67, if you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. There's a trick question. Jesus realized that right off. And he said, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I ask you, you would not answer. If Jesus, as he does here next, he tells them, you will see the Son of Man at the right hand of the mighty God coming on the clouds of heaven from now on. They were expecting an earthly Messiah, but Jesus said, "If I told you who I really am, you won't believe me. If I asked you, who do you say that I am? If the high priest and the Sanhedrin and all these people said he's not the Messiah, then they would have a riot on their hands, because a lot of the people, remember, they hung on Jesus' words there at the temple." So Jesus answered, "But from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the mighty God." And this is going back to that Daniel 7, and this term that Jesus used, the Son of Man. You see, in a trial, you're trying to reach a verdict. The word verdict means to speak the truth. You're trying to reach a conclusion. And they're trying to, in this trial, the question is, who is Jesus? If he says he is the Messiah, then we can have him put to death. Folks, he is who he says he is. We sang that in our music today. You are who you say you are, Jesus. He's the Son of Man, this eternal one, the Son of God who humbled himself and came down to earth and took on the very form of a servant. He became obedient to death on the cross. It goes on there in Philippians 2 that the same one has been exalted to the right hand of God, and one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. He is who he says he is. And Jesus doesn't fail to testify to who he truly is as he's tried before the Sanhedrin. And to be at the right hand of God, guess what that also meant? If you're at the right hand of the mighty God, they recognize exactly, first of all, they knew the scripture, Daniel 7. And they knew that the one at the right hand of God, the Son of Man, was also the Son of God. And they said, "Are you saying you are the Son of God?" And Jesus said, "Well, you're saying that. You recognize it. You're saying you heard what I said, and now you're saying it. You just don't believe it." And the Sanhedrin, this group of 70 elders, the chief priest, the high priest as the supreme judge, the teachers of the law, he said, "We don't need to hear any more testimony. We have heard it from his own lips." And they decided he was guilty of blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God, when he wasn't, but he is, and was, and is, and forever will be. Jesus willingly went through all this. Back in 1647, I told you, it's been 400 years since a British royal had been arrested back in 1647. This was at the end of a several-year civil war, the English Civil War. You see, the Parliament, King Charles I, who was the son of King James, the King James Version Bible, his son, King Charles I, he decided he would finally reconvene Parliament after many years where they hadn't met, because he needed some money to fight his wars. And when they wouldn't do it, a war broke out between King Charles I and then the Parliament. They had their own army, and they had this several years war. And finally, they arrested King Charles I and put him on trial. And they said, "We want you to enter a plea." He said, "I will not answer to you." And they put the king to death, January 30th of 1649. They killed the king. King Charles I was guilty. He was a scoundrel. I want to tell you, Jesus Christ, the innocent one, the Son of God, the Son of Man, he came and willingly submitted himself to death on the cross for us. The question is, who do you say Jesus is? Maybe, like Peter, you have denied him. Maybe even you feel like I've betrayed Jesus I want to tell you, Jesus wants to restore you. Jesus wants to save you. If you confess Jesus Christ is Lord, you will be saved.